What does living the best life look like? What is the best life? And how do we engage with that? I've sat with many folk as we've wrestled with what is the best life to live. Because we can live a pseudo life, a superficial life, and we can continue to live it until we die. I've sat next to people as they have died on their deathbeds, and I've listened to them. I've sat with families as we've prepared for the funeral, and we've looked back and said, was this the best life? And it's a question I have to ask of myself. Am I living the best life for myself? I only have one life. This is not the dress rehearsal for life. This is it. And I was reminded by a statement that a colleague made about someone for whom he had taken a funeral. He said, "You die how you live." And that struck me. One day when I die, what will be reflection on my life and how did I live? And as I reflected on that, I looked into the life of Jesus. How did he live the best life? And we wrestle with that today. When I think about these questions for myself, I'm very aware that I'm a learner. I'm learning in these spaces. Sometimes I feel like I'm just a beginner and there are things that I still have to learn so deeply. But discipleship is about how we live and how we die. Following Jesus means that we live our lives in a way that would be honoring to God and modeled around the life of Jesus. Because you see, as Dallas Willard says, discipleship is the process of becoming who Jesus would be if he were you, if he were me. And Jesus knows better how to live our lives than we do. So what does that mean for me? And so during the season, I've been looking at some of the words of Jesus as he faced his own death and how that reflected on his life. Now, as a learner, I'm still learning. And these pictures do by no means give a full picture of who Jesus is throughout his life, but it does give us some keys and insights into this space. Jesus, therefore, is our role model, and we base our lives mostly on him, who said, "Not my will, but yours be done." Paul picks up on this and says, it's no longer I that live, but that Christ who lives in me. Wow, what does that mean? How does that unpack for you and for me? He goes on to say that for me to live is Christ, to die is gain. And therefore the Christ in me needs to be forming my life and informing my life and transforming my life. So as I wrestle with these things around who Jesus is and who Jesus wants me to be, here are some insights that I have been wrestling with and have by no means perfected. Jesus lived like he did because he lived an authentic life around his relationship with God. One of the first characteristics I see in the way he died was he said, "Father, forgive them." And this reminds me over and over again how gracious and forgiving God is. And Jesus reflects that nature of God towards me. Who would I be without God's grace and God's forgiveness? God has given to me and to you a great gift, unmeasured but undeserved. And therefore, because God has been gracious to us and says, "Father, forgive them," even long before we know we need to be forgiven or have asked for forgiveness, we are already forgiven. The appropriation of that is in our confession of our need for Christ and his grace and forgiveness. And therefore, how gracious am I towards others? I don't always feel gracious. Sometimes I feel entitled, and sometimes I feel grumpy. But when I do feel God's grace flowing in and through me, there's an immense sense of satisfaction in that. But what are we doing in the area of forgiveness? One of the hardest areas in our lives is that area of learning to forgive. And we wrestle with this. I'm not going to unpack this further now, but when we model our lives on Jesus, we realize that while they were hanging him on the cross, he was able to forgive those who were doing that. Profound. What are your thoughts, and how are you doing in this space? The second thing I become aware of is Jesus is always invitational. And he says to the thief on the cross, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And again, Jesus says, come to me, come walk with me, come follow me. He's inviting all the time. And those who are antagonistic and resistant are the ones that he is confused by because the invitation is so authentic and real and genuine. And he invites us into a rich, deep experience of him each day, for today and for eternity. So the question I ask, how invitational are we? Who are we inviting into the presence of God? Who are inviting into our groups that we are part of, where we can learn to follow Jesus more? And how can we invite people into God's presence wherever we are, in whatever circumstance we are? I'm challenged by this. Maybe you are as well. The third one is in connecting. I find it so fascinating that Jesus, even on the cross, was connecting John and his mother and was concerned about connecting people. And he's saying to Mary, here is your son, and to John, here is your mother. And so out of his pain, he's reaching into others who will feel lost and alone. And he's saying to them, you are not alone. And as there is that connection, I'm just so fascinated by the fact that John welcomed Mary into his home. And I'm sure over many meals, they shared stories about Jesus that evolved into John's gospel. And so the question for me is, how relational are we? Are we connecting folk with each other and with Jesus and in a Christ-following community together? How relational are we? And how are we bringing about reconciliation between people without being trivial about things or superficial? How are we confronting the issues that divide us from one another and fulfill the prayer of Jesus to be one between races and genders and communities and language groups and nationalities and so on? How can we be a connecting people, to connect people in the kingdom of God? The next one I realize is that Jesus was never shy of asking the real questions. He was authentic to his core and cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he's willing to ask the hard questions. Who do you say I am? What are you looking for? What do you want me to do for you? And these are questions that are posed that help us to go deeper. And one realizes that Jesus was willing, even from the cross, to ask the deep, significant questions. And therefore we can go beyond the superficial to the authentic and real questions for ourselves. And Jesus gives us permission to do that, to wrestle through our doubt and come to a deeper experience of faith. And so how real are we? How authentic are we with ourselves? Are we journaling and reflecting on our actions and our words? And how are we allowing people to ask questions, and even questions we ask of ourselves, that would deepen our faith? Authentic. The fifth word from the cross speaks of the way Jesus lived as one who was openly honest. Throughout his life, he had said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. And he called people into a place of self-awareness and honesty about what they wanted and what they needed. And he said to them, if you are thirsty, come to me and I'll give you to drink. But on the cross, he was able to say, I am thirsty. In other words, there are things that I need. And it speaks of the mutuality that we have in our relationship with God. There are things that God needs of us, that Jesus needs of us, that we can do to minister to him, even as he does those ministry things to us that we need. So the question we're asking is, as we think about our lives, are we openly honest? Are we saying things as they are and they need to be said? Do we mean what we say, and do we say what we mean? And that takes a gentleness and a loving nature to express oneself with open honesty. And so, are you aware of people's needs? When they say things, believe them and understand that behind those words is something that they are expressing to you that you need to hear. But also, can we desire more of God? As we go to God, can we say, I am thirsty for more of you. As the deer pants for the water, so I long for you. That's a part of the journey that Jesus lived, and that's how he died. The sixth one from the cross, Jesus acknowledged that he had done something and it was finished. Seemingly so, the kingdom hadn't fully come and there were still people around him that didn't understand him. There's so much unfinished. And yet he was able to say, I've done what I came to do. This is the role that I came to play, and I have done it, and I've done it well. The books are balanced. The price has been paid. Tetelestai. It is done. And so it is not a sense of resignation. It's a sense of accomplishment. And so I ask the question, How are you in your getting things completed? Are you a strong finisher on the things that God has given you to do? Those tasks that are before you. Not the things perhaps that are temporal, perhaps those things that are transient, but those things that matter, those things that are significant. Are you finishing those things, completing the tasks that God has given you to do? And what things have you left unfinished that need your attention? Write those down, reflect on those, because that's how Jesus lived his life. He finished what God had given him to do. What an amazing sense. I've done my part. I've finished that which was given to me to do. A great sense of accomplishment. And the last one is a word of devotion. From the cross he says, into your hands I commit my spirit. That is how he lived his life. His whole life was one lived in devotion to God, saying, God, what do you want me to do? What is your way for me? So often we go to God with our agendas and ask him to bless it. But we should be going to God and saying, God, what is your agenda? Because we know that when we are doing God's agenda, we fit into God's will and purpose. And of course, that is going to be blessed. And so how committed are we to Christ? What is that prior commitment? Seeking first the kingdom of God. And how can we live a more devoted life? What spiritual disciplines can we put in place to help us in that space? And so the life of God is given to us in Jesus, and he shows us how to live. And to follow Jesus as a disciple means we live a life from inside of ourselves. For me to live as Christ, to die as gain, because Jesus knows better how to live our lives than we do. And so we come in an act of saying, Jesus, teach me. And from his words as he died, he gives us insights into his life. And therefore, the key word that I end with today is the word receive. Receive God's grace and mercy. Receive his invitation, RSVP. Receive that connection with himself and with others in his community. Receive the authenticity, the realness of a deep relationship with God, and then live it with integrity outside. Receive the care that comes from receiving from God and giving back to God and in ministry to others. But receive the quenching of your thirst. Receive a sense of accomplishment. Why? Because the completed work of Jesus on the cross was done for you. That word is for you. Everything has been done. You don't have to earn it. Just receive it. And lastly, receive God's devotion to you. For God is deeply, deeply devoted to you. Respond by receiving his devotion and returning it as your gift to him. And so as we end, here's a blessing. May you live the best life today and every day until you die, and then some, for eternity. God bless you.